Welcome everyone. Today is our second webinar in a series of webinars that we are planning to help you implement the new marketing rule. So on today's webinar, we're going to spend the first 20 minutes or so, and we're going to focus on, testimonials. What are testimonials? What's an endorsement under the new marketing rule? What's the interplay between advertising and traditional solicitation activities under the new rule? When and how you'll be able to use testimonials and endorsements. And then we'll wrap it up by providing you some practical takeaways with respect to these provisions of the new rule. Now, we've devoted a lot of time on today's webinar for you to ask questions, so we strongly encourage you to do so by typing them into the chat box during your presentation. I'm expecting a lot of questions, and so the sooner you can get them in, the sooner I can kind of read through them, and we can try to answer as many as we can. But if for some reason we can't get through all your questions, no worries. We are, they will help us in sort of identifying potential FAQs that the IA is going to put out on our website. The questions will also be useful to us in identifying issues where we might need to get more clarification. So before I turn it over to Mike and Laura to sort of run through those provisions of the new rule, let me just give you a quick status update on where we are with respect to the effective date. So the rule becomes effective 60 days after it's published in the Federal Register. Once it's published in the Federal Register, firms will have about 18 months to come into compliance. Now, obviously, everything gets started with that date being published. So the rule has been sent over to the OMB office, and they are supposed to publish it. Now, I guess one thing that's sort of a potential wrinkle in all this is that the new administration that came into office yesterday published an executive order whereby they had ordered government agencies to freeze all rules that are pending with the OMB. So we're not exactly clear as to whether or not that applies to the SEC. It's an independent agency. We're still trying to work through what that means, but I think as a practical matter, it's safe to assume that the rule being published is going to be delayed, potentially for some significant amount of time. We've actually reached out to the SEC staff this morning. They've gotten back to us, and we're still trying to figure out, and we'll continue to have discussions with them on where we are. Another issue that we're talking to the SEC staff about is that once the rule becomes effective, and during that 18-month transition period, whether or not firms will be able to come into partial compliance. We've already gotten confirmation from the staff that once it becomes effective, you can start complying with the new rule straight away, as long as you comply with all provisions of the new rule. But we're hopefully trying to talk to them about potential for partial compliance, so we'll keep you posted. So please type in your questions. At this point, I'm going to turn it over to Mike to get us started. Mike.
All right, thank you, Sanjay. So the first issue we need to address, because we're going to focus on testimonials and endorsements today, is getting our definitions in order. What is a testimonial? What is an endorsement? So let's jump to the next page and jump right in. In thinking about the rule writ broadly, there are really 5 elements of the new rule, of the new marketing rule. General prohibitions, testimonials and endorsements, third-party ratings, performance, and a large set of definitions. We're really only going to focus on 2 of those 5 sets of provisions today. First, starting at the far right, definitions, and then also the substantive requirements that attach to testimonials and endorsements. To get ourselves started, we really need to get a grasp of what a testimonial is, what an endorsement is, and the circumstances that each of them do and do not represent an advertisement under the rule. Once we have a grasp of that, then we will turn over into talking about the substantive requirements that are imposed on those testimonials and endorsements. So let's jump right into definitions with the next slide, please. So at first, it seems very straightforward. A testimonial is any statement of a client's or an investor's experience with the investment advisor or its supervised persons. By contrast, an endorsement is any statement made by a non-client or a non-investor that describes the endorser's or that person's experience with the advisor or its supervised person. The difference here is essentially with respect to a testimonial. If I'm giving a testimonial, I am saying that I believe that the services provided to me were great. I had a great experience with the advisor. An endorsement, by contrast, is someone who hasn't received those services, but nevertheless makes a recommendation or makes a statement about the advisor that is promotional in nature or supportive of some quality of the advisor as it pertains to the advisor's advisory services. These are some new terminologies for us, particularly as it pertains to endorsement. And as we'll address a little bit more later on, particularly because in the marketing rule, we have taken what used to be the advertising rule and what used to be the cash solicitation rule and pulled them all together. So if we approach this from a cash solicitation perspective, what we used to call a solicitation is now either a testimonial or an endorsement, depending on whether the person who is being paid to say something kind about the advisor is a client or not a client of the advisor. Usually it will be an endorsement. And what we used to call a solicitor, we now have the general term of a promoter, where a promoter is a person who gives a testimonial or an endorsement. Laura, let me turn it over to you to get a little bit more deep on the definitions so that we can get very precise. Next slide, please.
Great. So building on what Mike said, a testimonial could include opinions or statements about the investment advisory expertise or capabilities of the advisor or its supervised persons. Supervised persons means your officers, partners, directors, or employees, or anyone else who provides investment advice on your behalf and is subject to your supervision or control. The definition encompasses solicitation and referral activities by both people and entities. For example, the solicitor, or I should say promoter, could be a firm that solicits for an advisor, such as a broker-dealer or a bank, or it could be an individual at that entity, such as a registered rep. Other examples could be an unaffiliated fund of funds or a feeder fund that solicits investors in an underlying fund or a master fund. Turning to the next slide. The definition of endorsement, as you can tell, is very similar to a testimonial, except that, of course, it's by someone who's not a current client or investor, but still indicates approval or support or recommends the advisor or its supervised persons. Next slide. So now that we've gone over the definitions of testimonial and endorsement, let's look at how these terms fit within the definition of advertisement, starting with the second prong of the definition. This part of the definition applies to a compensated testimonial or endorsement. It applies whether or not the communication is made orally or in writing, whether or not the communication is made to just one person or to more than one person, and whether or not the compensation is cash or non-cash. Some examples of non-cash compensation are directed brokerage, awards or other prizes, reduced advisory fees, gifts and entertainment. The release specifically said that attendance at training and education meetings, such as annual conferences that some companies hold, are not non-cash compensation. So they would not be covered by this definition, provided that the person's not attending in exchange for solicitation activities. So there will be cases where you'll need to think about the facts and circumstances, such as the timing of when a benefit is given and whether there was a mutual understanding between the advisor and the person giving the testimonial and or endorsement, whether it's really an exchange. By contrast, if you have an uncompensated testimonial or endorsement, that's when you will look to prong one of the definition of advertisement to figure out whether it fits within the definition. That brings us to the interplay between advertising and solicitation activities under the new rule, for which I'll turn it over to Mike, and we can go to the next slide.
Okay, thank you, Laura. There seems to be a bit of confusion about these two prongs of the definition of an advertisement and how they relate to testimonials and endorsements. So if we go to the next slide, we're going to try to disambiguate this a little bit to the best of our ability. Now, we don't have the definition of an advertisement here on the slide. That's by design, but I'll run through it real quickly so that we can understand when we're talking about the first prong and the second prong, what we're talking about. So the first prong of an advertisement pertains to things that the advisor does directly or indirectly. It is the actual definition is any direct or indirect communication an investment advisor makes to more than one person or to one or more persons if the communication includes hypothetical performance that offers the investment advisors investment advisory services with regard to securities to prospective clients or investors in the private fund advised by the investment advisor, or that offers new investment advisory services with regard to securities to current clients. The idea there really is any direct or indirect communication by an investment advisor to more than one person, okay? And what that means is it doesn't matter whether that communication has within it a testimonial or an endorsement. If it's done by the advisor, direct or indirect, that's going to be an advertisement under prong one. Prong two pertains to testimonials and endorsements that may or may not fit within prong one. The definition under prong two is any endorsement or testimonial for which an investment advisor provides compensation directly or indirectly, but it does not include any information contained in a statutory or regulatory notice filing or other required communication, provided that the information is reasonably designed to satisfy the requirements of that notice. So let's think then about how those two play with one another. Starting with the second prong at the bottom of the page. If there is a compensated testimonial or endorsement, if I am the advisor and I pay someone and I pay them above a de minimis amount and I pay them cash or I pay them something of value, I compensate them in some manner other than paying cash. In those situations, it doesn't matter whether I, the advisor, put together the communication. It doesn't matter whether I've actually reviewed it or approved it. If I have paid them to make those communications are considered advertisements, whether they are written, whether they are made orally, whether they are to one person, whether they are to several persons, okay? And the reason that we have this second prong is because this rule is written in a way that it needs, or it's designed to capture communications made by third parties that are acting as agents of the advisor. That's what this second prong pertains to. There can be situations where a communication is an advertisement for more than one reason. A good example would be if I am an advisor and I have paid Sanjay to say nice things about me and to convince investors that they should place their assets with me to manage. And then I take the statements that Sanjay has made, I put those into a fact sheet or a flip book or my website, and I, as the advisor, make that communication public. Under those situations, I'm going to have an advertisement under both the first prong and the second prong. Now, by contrast, there are some situations where testimonials or endorsements that are not advertisements under the second prong can be advertisements under the first prong. A good example would be if I didn't pay Sanjay and Sanjay is just so impressed by the quality of my advisory services that he wrote me a letter that says many great things about the services that I provide. When I republish the things that he has said, his statements are an endorsement, and his endorsement is included in the advertisement that I have sent around. It's not a compensated endorsement. So if he sent that letter to a third party without sending it to me, then that's not an endorsement that I have any obligations for. But when I republish it, it becomes an advertisement and becomes subject to the rule. So in italics here, we have our effort to try to disambiguate all of this, which is if you as the advisor are the person making the communication, it's an advertisement. And if you are paying someone to say good things about you, it doesn't matter whether you make the communication or they make the communication, it's an advertisement. Only when Sanjay says something great about me to a third party and I didn't pay him to do that, is that endorsement or testimonial, not an advertisement. Okay, Laura, I'll pass it back over to you to talk a little bit more about how these work together, and then we can move into the requirements of the rule.
Great, slide 12. So when and how can advisors use testimonials and endorsements? Well, let's look at the next slide. So the rule will permit an advisor's advertisements to include testimonials and endorsements, but you will have to follow certain conditions that we've laid out in this chart and we'll discuss in detail on the next few slides. The conditions are listed across the top of the chart here and include required disclosures, advisor oversight and compliance. The final rule will require an advisor to have a written agreement with certain promoters and have a reasonable basis for believing that any testimonial or endorsement complies with the rule. And in some cases, the people who give the testimonial or endorsement will be subject to disqualification if they've engaged in misconduct in the past 10 years. And then listed in the left column of the chart, we've shown that there are some partial exemptions from some of the conditions, such as de minimis compensation, which is you've paid less than $1,000 during the preceding 12 months to a particular promoter. If that's the case, you do not need to have a written agreement with the promoter, and the promoter is not subject to the disqualification condition. Same thing with uncompensated testimonials or endorsements. There's also partial exemptions for affiliated personnel, which are an advisor's partners, officers, directors, or employees, or a person that controls, is controlled by, or is under common control with the advisor, or is a partner, officer, director, or employee of such a person. For this exemption to apply, the affiliated personnel exemption, the affiliation between the advisor and that person has to be readily apparent. So for example, they share the same name, same firm name, the same branding, the business card flat out says the person represents the advisor. Or if it's not readily apparent, it has to be disclosed to the client or investor at the time that the testimonial or endorsement is disseminated. And the advisor would have to document the person's status at the time it's disseminated. Also, promoters that are broker dealers are exempt from some of the disclosure and disqualification requirements to the extent that they're already subject to overlapping requirements under Reg BI and the Exchange Act rules, and I'll get into more detail on that in a minute. Also, certain persons who are covered by Rule 506D of Reg D with respect to a securities offering are exempt from some of this because, again, there are already overlapping disqualification requirements under the 33 Act. So let's look a little bit deeper into these conditions on the next slide. Here are the
Laura,
three.
actually, before you move on, can we go back to that slide real quickly? And the reason I'm asking that is that we do have a question in that's come through that I think it would be really helpful to have this slide in front of us while we answer it. And the question is, what is the difference between a paid testimonial or endorsement versus a non-paid one? And there are really, the answer is that there are two differences. The first difference is, let's suppose that it's an advertisement. And if it's an advertisement, you can see here the difference between the first row and the third row. If it's an uncompensated testimonial, you don't have to have a written agreement. The advisor doesn't have to have a written agreement with the person with the promoter making the testimonial or endorsement, and the advisor doesn't have to concern themselves with whether the person making the testimonial or endorsement has engaged in some bad act that would otherwise disqualify them. The second difference is the point that I was making in the prior section, that if a promoter is uncompensated, if I am not paying that person to make the testimonials and the endorsements, then I only need to worry about these rules to the extent that I take the things that they are saying and republish them. I don't need to worry, using my prior example, if Sanjay leaves his office later on today and walks out and tells a couple of third parties nice things about me. Those are uncompensated testimonials for which I'm not responsible. But if I then republish them, I am. Sorry, Laura, back to you.
No problem. All right, next slide. Just again, looking at the three major conditions. So the purpose of the required disclosures is to make prospective clients and investors aware of conflicts of interest to help prevent misleading testimonials and endorsements. Either the advisor can provide the disclosures or the promoter can provide them, so long as the advisor reasonably believes that the promoter is actually disclosing them. The oversight condition will require advisors to monitor third-party statements for compliance with the rule. There are two parts to this condition. One, an advisor that pays compensation over the de minimis amount for a testimonial endorsement must have a written agreement with the person giving it, except for certain affiliates. And two, the advisor must have a reasonable basis for believing that the testimonial endorsement complies with the specific restrictions and requirements in the marketing rule. And as far as disqualification, the rule prohibits an advisor from compensating bad actors, either directly or indirectly, for testimonials and endorsements if the advisor knows, or in the exercise of reasonable care should know, that the person giving it is an ineligible person at the time that the testimonial or endorsement is disseminated. So let's look even more deeply into what these conditions mean.
Hey Laura, just
Yes.
got a question. Can you just clarify the de minimis amount and what it means if you're sort of getting paid underneath that amount?
The de minimis amount means $1,000 or less in a 12-month period. And I think Mike went over what it means. You're exempt from certain of the conditions. But I would like to talk some more about the required disclosures. So the way we've listed it here, so the marketing rule requires that an advisor disclose or reasonably believe that the person giving the testimonial or endorsement discloses clearly and prominently three things at the time the testimonial endorsement is disseminated. First, if it's a testimonial, you have to say it was given by a current client or investor, or if it's an endorsement, you have to say that it was given by a person other than a current client or private fund investor.
Well, Laura, let's jump to the next slide, actually, for this.
Okay, yes, thank you. You also have to prominently disclose that cash or non-cash compensation was provided for the testimonial or endorsement. And you have to prominently give a brief statement of any material conflicts of interest on the part of the person giving the testimonial endorsement resulting from the advisor's relationship with such person. So those are the three things that have to be disclosed clearly and prominently. And we'll talk about what that means in a second. In addition to that, you have to give these other two disclosures. The marketing rule requires that an advisor disclose the material terms of any compensation arrangement, including a description of the compensation, directly or indirectly, to the person for the testimonial or endorsement. And you also have to give a description of any material conflicts of interest on the part of the person giving it, resulting from the relationship with the advisor. The clear and prominent disclosures have to be delivered within, quote, within the testimonial or endorsement. And all of these disclosures have to be delivered at the time that the testimonial or endorsement is disseminated. And I just want to make a note about what the adopting release said about how detailed you have to get about describing the amount of compensation and terms of compensation, because I know that's always a tricky area. And I'm just going to quote a brief statement from the release. It says, if a specific amount of cash compensation is paid, the advertisement should disclose that amount. If the compensation takes the form of a percentage of the total advisory fee over a period of time, then the advertisement should disclose such percentage and time period. So let me pause there. And I know we can talk a little bit about how and what clearly and prominently means, Mike.
Yeah, I think that this is going to be a very important concept to understand early on when advisors are thinking about how they are going to frame their approach to the new rule. Of these three disclosures, disclosures 2 and 3 should be relatively detailed, and they can be delivered through any number of means, including, according to the adopting release, through hyperlinks when the context permits and when that wouldn't otherwise be misleading. So for example, Laura, to your point on the compensation, if now I'm the advisor, if I need to disclose what my percent commission is or disclose the dollar amount, that is something that I would generally do in the disclosures that are highlighted by number 2. If I'm going to disclose a lot of conflicts to make sure that I am not misleading end clients in any fashion, that's something I'm going to do in number 3. And I think that advisors will pull together disclosure documents that are relatively thorough to comply with number 2 and number 3, and those can be provided through a number of means. The real issue here, I think, is with number 1. And the disclosures that need to be provided in number 1 are relatively short, relatively simple, and if you read the expectation set forth in the adopting release, the expectation is that they will be delivered as a part of the communication, which is to say, if there is an endorsement that is given, within that endorsement that is given, the promoter needs to include these disclosures. That might make sense. That might be relatively easy in an email. That might make sense. It might be relatively easy on a website or in a blog post. It becomes a lot more difficult in an oral conversation. I saw that one of our commenters flagged that issue. It becomes a lot more difficult if, for example, an advisor hires a promoter that is like an influencer and makes statements about the advisor via Twitter. Because in oral conversations, the expectation here from the SEC is that the recommendation will be accompanied by these disclosures orally at the time that it is given. The expectation is, notwithstanding that tweets have a very limited number of characters that can be used, but that if there is an endorsement given in a tweet or testimonial given in a tweet, that these disclosures will accompany that endorsement or testimonial in the tweet. That there can be no linking, there can be no separation between the endorsement or testimonial and where these disclosures are given. So that then begs the question, a couple of questions. First, as to the tweets, well, how do we actually get that done? How do we get that done on Twitter? Look, my view is that it would probably be acceptable, as is quite common on Twitter these days, for any number of tweets, let's say it's 7 tweets long, to have a moniker in the first one that says it's the first of 7, which gives you more room, and you can include the disclosures. Promoters won't like that, but it at least is a solution that seems reasonable. For the oral conversations, it's easy for a promoter to say this. It's going to be pretty difficult for an advisor to verify that the promoter actually said it. So thinking about, and we'll talk about this more later, and I hope we have questions on it, thinking about how an advisor can form a reasonable basis that promoters that are giving oral testimonials and oral endorsements are also including these disclosures is going to be a bit of a challenge when it comes time to implement these requirements.
Thanks, Mike. And I just want to give a little bit more detail. If the promoter is a registered broker-dealer, there are very specific rules to follow in that case. If the recommendation is subject to Reg BI, then the broker-dealer is not subject to any of these additional disclosure requirements that we're talking about, on the theory that they're already giving disclosure about conflict and compensation under Reg BI. However, if it's a recommendation that is not subject to Reg BI, if it's made to a person that is not a retail person, then the broker-dealer does not have to give the clear and prominent disclosures. And Mike, correct me if I'm wrong, but they don't have to comply with the other disclosure requirements either, because this is not a retail customer. However, if it is a retail customer, then you need to give everything. You need to give the clear and prominent disclosures and the other disclosures. Okay, let's move on to the next condition. So the written agreement has to describe the scope of the agreed upon activities and the terms of the compensation for those activities. And I just want to note a couple of changes from the current cash solicitation rule. The promoter no longer has to give a copy of the advisor's brochure to the prospect, and the advisor no longer needs to obtain a written acknowledgement from each client that it has received the required disclosure from the promoter or solicitor. If there might be some questions about what constitutes a reasonable basis for believing that the testimonial endorsement complies with the rule. It is a facts and circumstances test, but some examples were given in the release, such as periodically sampling some investors who were referred to you to assess whether the promoter's statements complied with the rule. You could also try to include terms in your written agreement with the promoter so that the promoter has to let you pre-review their testimonials or endorsements, or it limits what the promoter can say in those statements. And finally, a little bit more on disqualification, which is the final condition. Note that this is, next slide, please. Note that it is broader than disqualification under the current solicitation rule. So the rule prohibits an advisor from compensating a person directly or indirectly for a testimonial endorsement if the advisor knows or should know that the person giving it is an ineligible person at the time the testimonial endorsement is disseminated. So let's break that down a little bit. An ineligible person is a person who is subject to a disqualifying commission action or any disqualifying event, and as well as certain of that person's employees. So a disqualifying commission action is any SEC opinion or order barring, suspending, or prohibiting that person from acting under the federal securities laws. The new rule also expands it to certain CFTC and SRO, self-regulatory organization, actions. As we know from our chart, the disqualification provisions only apply to compensated promoters, so not de minimis compensation and not uncompensated testimonials and endorsements. There is a 10-year look back period, so that's now consistent with what you report in Form ADV. It's 10 years for everything. And this applies starting at the effective date. So you do not have to look back prior to the effective date for these types of actions. I think I'll stop there. So maybe we can start trying to answer some questions that have come in.
Yeah, great. And we've had several. So, and I also want to encourage people to keep typing in questions, and also not just on testimonials and endorsements, but at this point, any questions that you have about the new rule as well. So Mike, we've got a couple of questions on LinkedIn endorsements and how those sort of play under the new rule, and specifically by employees of the firm. So what are some of the things that folks need to be thinking about there?
Well, that is a tough question. The unfortunate fact here is that LinkedIn uses the term endorsement, which corresponds exactly to the terminology used in the rule. What we didn't discuss in the slides here is that elsewhere in the adopting release, there is a discussion of whether or not third-party content in social media sites, either maintained by an advisor or maintained by the advisor's associated persons, would be attributed to the advisor. And here, I think the best way to approach this, and I want to qualify by saying this is just my opinion as of right now, and there may in fact be staff guidance that addresses this in the future. So this is not legal advice. But my view is that if we look to the other guidance in the adopting release, it gives a lot of comfort that if an advisor is not actively soliciting endorsements or actively soliciting other content from third parties on a site, that the advisor should not be responsible for the content that's put on the site. and I think that should apply to LinkedIn endorsements as well. But all of that, all of that comfort, it goes away very rapidly if the advisor solicits the endorsements, puts something on the LinkedIn site that says, I'm a wealth manager and I invite anyone who's had an experience with me to share it here on LinkedIn, or redistributes those endorsements in any way. If they do that, then they've taken a step to adopt those endorsements, and then I think at that point they would transform into endorsements subject to the rule.
So Mike, in terms of the disclosure of compensation, like how much detail do you need to go into? Someone gave an example: if I pay Tiger Woods $20 million, do you actually have to disclose that you paid $20 million for the endorsement?
So I am not saying that you would need clear and prominent disclosure saying that Tiger Woods has been paid $20 million. I think what you would need is in the commercial or tweet or whatever that Tiger Woods gives on your behalf. As a quick aside, I find it odd in this day and age that people are paying Tiger Woods $20 million to support their fiduciary activities, but that may be neither here nor there. In the tweet that Tiger Woods issues, you are going to need to ensure that he says, I've been paid to say this about the advisor. And that tweet is going to need to make some reasonable reference to the disclosures that are not clear and prominent, and those disclosures that aren't presented in a clear and prominent fashion, but do need to be delivered in some fashion to the recipients of that endorsement. Those are going to have to say Tiger Woods paid, that I paid Tiger Woods $20 million, and the term 20 million per the guidance should be used.
So Laura, we've been getting some questions on sort of the difference between what's considered non-cash. So maybe the way to ask this is, can you sort of give some examples of non-cash that wouldn't you wouldn't think of non-cash, but there may be some questions. I guess some examples I had is like golf outings, if you pay for those.
Sure. Before I do, I just want to correct something. I think I misspoke when I was talking about registered broker-dealers. I just want to clarify, if a registered broker-dealer is giving a recommendation that is not subject to Reg BI, then they do have to give the clear and prominent disclosures, but are not required to comply with the other disclosure requirements. So sorry about that. That's a confusing area. So as far as non-cash, yeah, I think I mentioned like directed brokerage, gifts and entertainment. I mean, I think a golf outing, you're gonna have to make a judgment whether that was given with the expectation that the attendee would then give a testimonial endorsement for your firm. But I don't know, Mike, if you have any.
And just to, I mean, one example we got is an informal referral network where the firm, Mike, you want to speak to that?
Well, look, yeah, I think that some of the situations that will be most vexing here are what I'm going to characterize as favors or cross referrals. What we sometimes refer to as shelf space, right? Of favoring one product over another. Those sorts of favors, if they are formalized, and in particular, if there's an understanding among the parties that it is being done to benefit one another, probably are considered non-cash compensation that needs to be disclosed. And the tough thing here is we really don't have a good and clean set of rules that can be applied to determine where there's cash and non-cash compensation. Now, it's a little bit early days to be giving recommendations to firms as to how they can go about figuring that out. But if you think about some of the principles in Rule 20647 and what the SEC and the staff have said about those sorts of issues over time, it will likely make sense for firms to put together a reasonable list or a reasonable process to identify non-cash compensation, such that even if there's some dispute about whether a particular golf outing or whether a particular referral would constitute non-cash compensation, the firm at the very least shows that it has a process and it thought about this and put together what it considered to be reasonable standards. And that should go a long way to protecting it against that sort of second guessing.
And in addition to non-cash compensation, it's also going to be tricky to figure out what indirect compensation you pay. Maybe you don't pay an individual directly, but maybe you pay that person's employer, the firm, something. Maybe there's some revenue sharing. So there's a lot more types of compensation that are captured under the new rule to think about.
So another question just came in. A firm's employees that like a post that's made by the firm, is that an endorsement?
It may not be an endorsement due to the technicalities of how the term endorsement is used. But that said, if a firm's employee is liking or doing the sorts of things that we would consider to be endorsing the firm itself, that is going to entangle the firm with the content of that communication and possibly with other information on the page. Again, if we go back, and for those of you who are deep in this rule release, I think it's around page 24 or 25, there is some guidance around when these third-party sites or third-party content on sites maintained by the advisor would be imputed to the advisor. A part of that guidance is that advisors should, and this isn't in the rule, it's in the release, but the SEC states in the release that advisors should, if they don't want to be responsible for the activities of employees, should educate those employees to carefully not involve the advisory services provided by the advisor in their social media posts and communications. And I think that the imputed flip side of that is that if the employees are in fact involving themselves in liking or communicating or soliciting third-party content with respect to the advisory services provided by the advisor, then absent the advisor being able to show that they directed the employees not to do that, the advisor is going to be responsible for those communications as advertisements and subject to all the requirements of this rule.
And just to clarify, so when we're talking about endorsements and testimonials, we're talking about those that would fall under the definition of advertising. In other words, trying to obtain business, not for, like, say, if you're trying to lure future recruits, interns, something to the firm.
Yes, yeah, that's right.
Let's see, a lot of questions here.
I see one of the questions here says, how do we make the distinction between a solicitation and a compensated endorsement or testimonial on the other? And the answer is, right now, those are solicitations because right now we still have the cash solicitation rule. And once you come into compliance with the new marketing rule a year or two from now, there's no longer any concept of a solicitation as far as the rule is concerned, right? There are compensated endorsements, there are compensated testimonials, and those will replace, and the requirements applicable to those replace what used to be the requirements under the cash solicitation.
So, Mike, would a referral to a TAMP program be considered a compensated endorsement?
A TAMP, a turnkey asset management program?
Yeah.
That's a tough question. Look, if I'm a wealth manager and I have elected to work with one or two TAMPs on behalf of my clients to provide back office services, and those back office services are limited to reporting and accounting, then, in that situation, the TAMP isn't providing advisory services. And so if what we're talking about is the wealth manager suggests to clients that they use a platform that the wealth manager prefers for back office services, then I don't think that's a testimonial or an endorsement, because those services are not advisory services. And I don't know if that's exactly the question the way that they were hoping to get an answer to the question, but I think that's probably the way to approach it.
Okay. see. Okay, let's switch gears. I had a question on presenting performance under the new rule. So the question is, if we have a pitch book that uses graphs of our gross performance versus, say, the S&P in some slides, and those slides have disclosures noting it is gross of fees, and directs people to the slide later in the presentation that has a chart with all the required disclosures versus gross versus net, is this permissible even though the net performance is not represented in those specific graphs?
Well, it's tough to give an answer to that other than maybe, because I think that, look, the way that you framed it, Sanjay, it sounds like they have a page that has gross, and then somewhere else they have a page that has gross and net, right? And that, if you were to ask members of the Division of Investment Management staff, my expectation is that they would say that that's probably not acceptable, because if you can put gross and net on one page, you can put gross and net on another page and present them with equal prominence, right? And if we say yes to that, then the gross performance might be on page 2, and the gross and net might be on page 73 after 5 pages of disclosure. Now, another way to look at it, though, is it probably would be acceptable to present on consecutive pages of a presentation gross and net performance in a way that facilitates ease of comparison. And furthermore, I think that the answer to that question is a little bit tough right now, because we have here a new rule set with rules that haven't been interpreted by the staff, and for which we don't have any enforcement actions that kind of demonstrate to the market what sort of activities are considered acceptable and non-acceptable. So the answer there is probably not, but there may be circumstances if we get some more facts and if it's presented in a reasonable fashion that something like that could be acceptable. But a flat yes, I don't think we could get.
Okay. So like another question, this is again not related to endorsements or testimonials, but and this has to do with past specific recommendations of the current rule. So can firms use 1 or 2 stock examples in ads now? If so, what are the disclosure requirements of the rules?
Yeah, that doesn't have much to do with the current marketing rule or the endorsements and testimonials, does it? But so the answer there is, can firms use 1 or 2 stock examples in ads now? The short answer is no, because that would be highlighting past specific recommendations. And until you come into full compliance with the new marketing rule, you must adhere to Rule 20641 as it stands right now. There may be some creative ways to get that outcome, though, by, for example, if your advertisements satisfy the requirements of the Franklin No Action Letter, which essentially are that you select a past specific recommendation according to a non-performance based criterion, and you do it consistently quarter over quarter, you could discuss some of those stocks that are in that list, and you can even discuss some of those and not others, but you need to be very careful to do it in a way that's not otherwise misleading. So you're not, for example, highlighting the best stocks from the list, and you certainly couldn't discuss performance. So there might be some creative ways to do that, but not because of the new marketing rule.
So Laura, so we've gotten some questions on reduced client fees. One just came in. So what about favorable statements made by clients that have reduced fees relative to other clients? How should firms think about those statements in the context of the new rule?
So again, you have to think about whether the reduced fees were given in exchange for a testimonial or endorsement. So you just have to consider, there, as Mike said, there are no bright line rules, unfortunately, to figure out some of these situations. But the rules of thumb are, looking at the timing of the benefits in relation to the testimonial endorsement, and whether there was a mutual understanding.
Mike, I'm getting a lot of questions here. Did one jump out at you that you want to?
I saw one just show up here that I think is very interesting, that I had not considered, but the question is, would paid actors in television commercials now be considered endorsers, thus requiring prominent disclosures? And if so, to what level? That's a great question. And as I said, we haven't looked at that, but I think that the answer would be, if Fidelity, for example, has a commercial in which two paid actors are wrapping up their careers and looking forward to retirement and walk into the sunset hand in hand, while there's a voiceover talking about how Fidelity can help people prepare for retirement. I don't see an endorsement in that commercial, right? On the other hand, if there's a commercial and a paid actor pretends to be a happy client, and or the paid actor says something along the lines of, I go to Fidelity because they've demonstrated to me over the decades that they know what they're doing, then I think that in that situation, Fidelity would need to consider whether that paid actor who is making what is an endorsement in the commercial, right, would need to satisfy these three prompts, or the three disclosures, and they may need to. And I know that I am not trying to pick on Fidelity here. However, they do issue commercials, and that's why I use them as an example.
Yeah. So Laura, we've gotten several questions again on the de minimis, the $1,000 per testimonial. So is it per testimonial? Okay, go ahead.
I'd like to address that one. So the de minimis is $1,000 or less per promoter during a 12-month period. So for example, there might be an automated device platform that has a refer a friend program. You could give the same promoter small amounts, $50 for each referral they bring in over the years. So it is not per testimonial, it is per promoter in a 12-month period.
So Mike, what about former employees of the firm that are giving endorsements? The firm gets business, but there's no current compensation being given. How do you sort of think about that?
So the way I would approach that is, the first question I would ask is whether there was either an explicit or implicit understanding with the former employees at the time of their departure or when they were employed that they would say good things about the firm when they left. Chances are there is not, but that I think is the first question to ask. If there was an implicit understanding on their departure that they're going to endorse the firm, then I think we would probably see a compensated endorsement there. If we don't have that, and you just have a person who left the firm who's saying good things about the firm, I don't think that's an advertisement. I don't think it's an advertisement because there's no arrangement to compensate that former employee to do those things, and the former employee is no longer under the firm's control. Now, by contrast, if the firm redistributes or republishes one of those endorsements, then the firm is creating an advertisement. The advertisement contains an endorsement, right? And the firm is going to need to include all the disclosures that are required for endorsements under those circumstances. And this would include, in this situation, highlighting potential material conflicts of interest, which I think the former employee relationship would be one.
Okay.
Any thoughts on that, Laura? This is an area that you and I have discussed a bit, and it is a little bit tough to unpack.
No, I don't have anything to add there. I think you answered it well.
Okay. I think I had a question in here about internal versus external promoters. I can't see that now. I'll find it in a second. So Laura, we're getting these questions on sort of what's considered non-cash. What about revenue sharing arrangements, where the referral is not based on, where the compensation is not based on the referral actually being made? How would you sort of consider that?
When a compensation is not being based on the referral being made. So I think that sounds more like whether that's an indirect payment. So unfortunately, this is all facts and circumstances, so no easy answers here. But yes, revenue sharing could be considered an indirect type of compensation.
Okay.
Yeah, I saw an interesting question pop up here, which is, and I'm sorry, Laura, did I interrupt you? I want to make sure you were done.
Oh no, go ahead.
Yeah. The question is, it seems straightforward at first, but actually it's a little bit more complicated than it seems. The question is, I read that registered investment companies are exempt from the rule. Is this true? Well, the answer is yes, and it's an unambiguous yes. But that also creates some interesting issues. One of the issues that it creates is if we were to scroll back up to the front of this, or to the beginning of this slide deck, we would see that a testimonial is given by either a current advisory client or a private fund investor, or an investor in a private fund managed by the advisor. So that doesn't capture, as a technical matter, investors in registered funds. It doesn't capture, for that matter, investors in 3C11 bank maintained collective investment trusts. And I personally found it a little bit odd that for this part of the rule, it was narrowed in that fashion. But the technical answer is, number one, yes, the rule doesn't apply to communication regarding registered investment companies. And when we're considering what's a promoter, testimonials cannot come from investors in registered funds managed by the advisor. But there'll be endorsements and look, be treated pretty similarly anyway.
Let's see. These questions are good. Some of them are just long, so I'm trying to understand them. Laura, was there any question that jumped out at you that you want to answer while I'm sort of?
Early on, there was a question about private funds. So it is literally only 3C1 and 3C7 funds. I think the question was something about segregated accounts. So it's only 3C1 and 3C7.
Okay. I got a question here. I'm not sure I get, maybe you'll get it, Laura, but if you compensate a party under a written agreement for successful referrals, introductions, they become a client, would anything they say when introducing the investment advisor be considered an endorsement? The compensation for the actual endorsement is zero. However, if the client ultimately decides to become a client, the introducer receives a percentage of ongoing management fees generated on the client accounts.
Hard to follow without seeing, but if there's if there's any payment given in return, then that sounds like it could qualify as a payment. So therefore, yes, you would need to.
If it's contingent compensation, what it really boils down to a commission, which certainly is compensation for these purposes.
Mike, how does the new marketing rule relate to Form CRS? Again, I'm not really sure I understand that question. Maybe you.
Well, okay. So I think that the way I would look at this is, number one, the information that an advisor places into Form CRS, that the advisor is obligated to put into Form CRS, as long as that information is reasonably related to the requirements of the form, that information will not be considered an advertisement under the rule. And I think that that's probably the answer to the question, right? Put together a Form CRS if you need to, if you have natural person clients. And as long as you're not layering in promotional statements or promotional content to Form CRS where it's not necessary, then your CRS is outside the scope of the rule.
So I know we're out of time, but let's just finish on this one last question. And I think there's several that sort of touch on this. So can we just, Laura, I know you talked about the disclosures and the types of disclosures between compensated and non-compensated. Can you just clarify the types of disclosures you have to make with respect to non-compensated?
Yeah, so I always refer to my chart on slide 13. So even if it's uncompensated, you still have to give all the required disclosures that we talked about, because there's still that concern about conflicts of interest and not being misleading. So I definitely would refer to that chart and keep it handy.
Okay. All right. So we're at the top of the hour. So so we're done with today's webinar. So thank you, Mike and Laura, for walking us through those provisions of the new marketing rule. So just a reminder, we have several IA resources that we're developing to try to help you. We have our marketing implementation group, which meets on a regular basis to sort of talk through implementation issues, and Mike's on those calls generally. So he's available there as well. Our next call is scheduled for February 2nd, Tuesday at 1 p.m. Eastern time. We'll be sending out an email to the group with more information, including the dial-in information. If you're not a member of that group and would like to join that group, just please just reach out to me or that email address that's at the end, and we can add you to the group. We're also developing a resource page where we'll post resource materials on there to help you. We have an online discussion forum, and we'll be having more of these webinars in the future. Next slide, please, Megan. And the last thing I want to mention is we have our compliance conference coming up, where we'll have a general session on the advertising rule, and Mike and I will be on the panel along with an in-house professional as well as a senior attorney from the SEC staff who worked on this rulemaking, which will be great to be able to hear directly from them. So please join us. It's virtual this year, and so please register and join us for that. And with that said, thank you all for participating. I know we didn't get to all your questions. They're helpful to us as we sort of develop FAQs for our website, and we'll try to answer these questions on our implementation group calls and on future webinars. But please keep asking them and keep please dialing in. So thank you everyone for listening today, and enjoy the rest of your day.